Okay, good evening to everyone. Thank you so much for joining in on a Thursday evening. I hope we'll do some interesting learning together. I put a link in the chat box here on the side to the source pages that that we'll be using tonight. So if anybody wants to download those source pages, then please do so. You should have the link here in the chat box. Maybe I'll just send it again.
Can Rav share the link again?
Yes, I just shared it again.
How do we download it?
You hit on the link, and then from there.
The link on the right, Google.
You should be able to download the source pages, and hopefully we'll make this as interactive as possible. So feel free at any point to ask questions, make comments, or you can also, if you prefer, to type it in the chat box about what we're learning. So what we'll try to do in these series of shiurim, tonight we'll start off with a sort of introduction to Yeshayahu. We'll start off even before that with a general introduction as to the learning of the Nevi'im, of the prophets. And then we'll study a little bit about Yeshayahu, about his background, a bit of his personal life as well. And from there, we'll move on over the next few weeks, learn a little bit more in Yeshayahu, and then begin to study the actual texts and the prophecies of Yeshayahu himself. Okay, so first, I'll just say briefly that most of the contents that I will be saying in these shiurim are not my own. They're from my father-in-law, Yosef Carmel. He wrote a book on Yeshayahu called I have it here, Tzofnat Yeshayahu, an excellent book in Hebrew, a little bit of a challenging read, but it's an excellent book in Yeshayahu, and most of the contents that I would be saying in these shiurim are from his book, which I highly recommend. Okay, so let's get started without further ado. So I'll share on the source screen. I'll share on the screen the source pages. Okay, so first, just a general introduction to when we try to approach studying any prophet, but especially a prophet like Yeshayahu, how do we even go about doing that? Okay, so there's an interesting passage in the Talmud. This is in Masechet Megillah, page 14a, where the Talmud discusses how many prophets did we actually have in Jewish history. So the Gemara there brings a contradiction. On the one hand, it states, Tanu Rabbanan, that our sages taught us that in other words, that we have 48 male prophets and 7 female prophets, which prophesied for Israel. If you're interested in the actual list, the Gemara there actually mentions who the 7 female prophets were. It says later on here that they were Sarah, Miriam, Dvorah, Hannah, Abigail, Huldah, Esther. It does not tell us who the 48 male prophets were. However, Rashi here in his commentary tells us who the 48 male prophets were. The difficulty with this is, and this is the Gemara there already points out, that just reading Tanakh, it's clearly evident that there were many more than just 48 prophets. There are places that are mentioned, passages in Tanakh which mention hundreds of prophets. So what is this list of 48 prophets and 7 women prophets about? So the Gemara then says, in the next passage, it says, that actually there were many more prophets, double the amount of the amount that left Egypt. Okay, now we know the amount of people that left Egypt is usually estimated around 600,000, at least just the males were 600,000 people. So double Kiyotzei Mitzrayim would come out to 1,200,000. Now obviously this number is not to be taken literally. It's an expression which comes to say a very large amount of prophets, but clearly more than 48. So how does the Gemara resolve this contradiction? So its answer is as follows. Ela נבואה שהוצרכה לדורות נכתבה, ושלא הוצרכה לא נכתבה. In other words, a prophecy that was needed for future generations was written down, and prophecy which was not needed for future generations was not written down. In other words, basically what the Gemara has told us that we had many, many thousands of prophets along the generations, but only a small amount of them were actually written down and included in the Tanakh, in the Bible. Based on what decision was it made, which prophets to write down their prophecies for future generations, if it was thought that their prophecy would be relevant for future generations as well, okay? If it was deemed that this prophecy was only relevant to that specific generation, then it was not written down and it was not included in the Tanakh, in the Bible as we have it. Now, this statement of Chazal, of our sages, has sort of an underlying assumption in it. And that assumption is that when a prophet is speaking, who is his main target audience? His main target audience is the people before him. In other words, the generation that he is speaking to. That's actually the main target audience of the prophet. It could be that his prophecy might be also relevant to future generations, but that's not necessarily so. We see that many, many more prophets, the large majority of prophets, their prophecy was not written down for future generations. Only a select few, 48 out of probably thousands or possibly more prophets were written down for future generations. So really, that actually teaches something very informative about who is a prophet actually speaking to. So generally we can see from this statement that usually when a prophet is speaking, his main target audience are the people that are before him. He's taking his words and he's standing and speaking to the people of his generation. He could be speaking to the king. He could be speaking to a broader audience, to whoever is willing to hear him, but that's his audience, the people of his time, and that's what he's addressing, the current situation that he's facing, and that's his main target audience. Now, it could be that maybe future generations will also have some relevance of that prophecy to them, and in that case, it was written down and included in Tanakh, but that's not necessarily so. Now, why is that important for the study of Tanakh, or for the study of the words of the prophets? Because what that tells us is that if we want to properly understand what a prophet is saying, we have to try to find out what the historical context, in what historical context he was speaking. What was the situation that he was speaking about? What was the situation that he was addressing? Because if that's his main target audience, then that's very important to understand what his message is. So that means, let's say, if for our purposes, if we're studying Yeshayahu, we want to know as much as we can what was happening in the times of Yeshayahu, and even more importantly, if we're addressing a specific prophecy, let's say we're studying a certain chapter in Yeshayahu, when we study that chapter, we would like to determine, even within the life of Yeshayahu, when precisely that prophecy was stated within the life of Yeshayahu, for example, and as we'll see, Yeshayahu prophesied for quite a long time. So we want to, and the situations across the life, during the life of Yeshayahu, changed dramatically within his lifespan. The situation in Israel changed dramatically across his life, his lifespan, as we will study. So each prophecy of Yeshayahu that we want to study, we would like to pinpoint as much as we can when it was said, and what was the situation that existed at the time that it was said. And if we understand that, then hopefully we can better understand the message of Yeshayahu as much as we can, as it was intended to his target audience in his generation. And hopefully from that, we'll also be able to see, okay, now we've understood what was the context that he was speaking, what was the message that he was trying to get across, and then we can try to understand how is that relevant to us, what lessons can we learn out from that. So that sounds great, but how do we go about doing that? So there are a number of things we can do. First of all, what's very helpful, and this is sort of the Tanakh itself trying to teach us this message, many prophecies will have some sort of date as to when they were said. Why does the Tanakh bother doing that? Because apparently it's important to know when it was said, because like we said, it's very relevant if you want to understand what the prophet was talking about, what Yeshayahu per se was talking about. When did he say it? What was the situation then? So when the Tanakh gives us a date, and often it will give us a date for a certain prophecy, that's very important information. So that's one thing. So that already can already give us the clue. Second thing we can do is check other places in Tanakh that are speaking about this very same time. So for example, when we're studying Yeshayahu, and for example, it will tell us that he was speaking during the time of this king of Yehuda, let's say he's speaking in the time of Uzziyahu, the king of Yehuda. So that's very good. Then we can go to other books in Tanakh, which also speak about the times of Amelech Uzziyahu, of King Uzziyahu. So we can go, for example, to Sefer Melachim, the book of Kings, and there are chapters that discuss what was going on during the times of Uzziyahu. And we can also go to the book of Divrei Hayamim, which also tells us what was going on in those times. So that already we have some important sources within the Tanakh itself that can teach us about what was happening there. Besides those books, other sources that are relevant is that some prophets were not operating alone. They had other prophets operating parallel to them. And Yeshayahu, for example, he wasn't operating alone. We will learn that besides Yeshayahu, there were at least 3 other prophets operating in his time. So another thing we could do, which will be very helpful, is try to compare what Yeshayahu is saying to what other prophets are saying at the same time. And if we put together a prophecy of Yeshayahu and let's say a parallel prophecy of another prophet, for example, it could be Hosea, it could be Amos, other prophets that were operating at the same time, that could give us a very interesting picture about what was going on. And we can pick up, bits and pieces of information from here and from there and put them all together, and we could, try to create a very interesting picture about what they were speaking about, what they were facing, what they were dealing with, and what message they were trying to get across. And another thing we could also do, of course, is try to go to external historical evidence. For example, we have archaeological sources, we have all kinds of historical sources about the periods that these prophets were operating. A lot of these kings of both the Jewish and non-Jewish, we have historical evidence about. So that's also something, archaeological evidence. So all of that, anything that we can do to try to get as much information about we can all be very helpful in trying to understand what the prophets were speaking about, in our case specifically what Yeshayahu was speaking about, and it can give us sort of a bit of insight as to what the message that the prophets, or this prophet Yeshayahu, was trying to get across to the audience that he said it, and from that hopefully draw some lessons to our lives as well. Okay, so that was a little bit of background as to the approach that we will take in the study of Yeshayahu. Now, without further ado, let's sort of jump in a little bit into Yeshayahu, and we'll start with the first verse, the first pasuk in Yeshayahu, which is sort of the title head for the entire book, and will give us some information about who was Yeshayahu. Okay, so let's go back again to the source pages. Again, if anybody has any questions or comments, feel free to interrupt me, either unmute yourselves or write in the chat box. Okay. Okay, so the first verse in Yeshayahu, here I'm in the source page of the Lambanim on page 1, is really a title for the entire book of Yeshayahu. Okay, I'm making a certain assumption. I'll explain why I'm claiming that it's a title for the entire book of Yeshayahu, but let's see the verse first of all. So it says, Chazon Yeshayahu ben Amos, asher chaza al Yehuda v'Yerushalayim, b'imei Uzziyahu, Yotam, Achaz, Yechizkiyahu, Malchei Yehuda. Translated, the prophecies of Isaiah, son of Amoz, who prophesied concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the reigns of Uzziah, Yotam, Achaz, and Chizkiah, kings of Judah. Okay, so we have three very important bits of information in this pasuk. The first is the identity of the prophet. So the identity is Yeshayahu, the son of Amoz. Okay, and we'll learn actually that the fact that he was the son of Amoz is a significant and valuable piece of information. Okay, because surprisingly, we do have some information about who this Amoz was. Second is the subject of the prophecy, and he says, that's what the verse says, Asher chaza al Yehuda v'Yerushalayim, that he prophesied, his prophecy was concerning Yehuda and Yerushalayim. Now, why is that important? Because we know that at those times, the kingdom of the Jewish people, or the Israelite people, was actually divided into two kingdoms. One was the kingdom of Yehuda, and the other kingdom was the kingdom of Yisrael. It was two separate kingdoms. And often, especially during certain periods of Yeshayahu's life, they didn't get along and they even were at war. Now, there were prophets that operated in Yehuda and Yerushalayim. Yehuda, again, the kingdom of the tribe of Yehuda, that its center was Yerushalayim. The center, as Yerushalayim, was founded by David. And there were prophets that operated in that area. And there were prophets that operated primarily in Malchut Yisrael, even parallel to Yeshayahu. Certain prophets operated mostly in the kingdom of Israel. And then we had certain prophets that operated in both areas. So here, the verse is telling us that Yeshayahu was operating within the kingdom of Yehuda and Yerushalayim, and that's very important because the situation in Yehuda and Yerushalayim was not the same, even though they were neighbors and they were brothers, but it was a different kingdom, and the situation and the political situation was often, and the spiritual situation was often very different between the two kingdoms. Now, there is a little bit of a difficulty in this sentence because I claimed earlier that this is a title for the entire book. Now, the commentators, some found difficulty with this statement that Yeshayahu prophesied concerning Yehuda and Yerushalayim, because actually, if you'll read throughout the book of Yeshayahu, even though the large majority of prophecies were about Yehuda and Yerushalayim, there are some chapters that Yeshayahu is prophesying not about Yehuda and Yerushalayim, but rather about other nations. There's a whole series of prophecies of Yeshayahu where he's actually addressing other nations. And that's why some took issue and said, how can you say that this verse is the title for the entire book? If it's the title for the entire book, then this statement, Asher chaza Yehuda v'Yerushalayim, is not precise because not the entire book is about Yehuda v'Yerushalayim. So I think the answer to that is that, true, there are certain prophecies of Yeshayahu that are not on Yehuda v'Yerushalayim, that are pertaining to other non-Jewish nations that existed at that time. But the large majority of the book is about Yehuda v'Yerushalayim, is the place where he operated was Yehuda v'Yerushalayim. So therefore, even though true that he also prophesied about some other nations, but it's still safe to say as a title to the book, Asher chaza Yehuda v'Yerushalayim, because again, that was the main subject of his prophecies, and sort of that unit of prophecies regarding other nations can sort of be seen as a book within a book. It's sort of its own separate unit within the book of Yeshayahu. Okay, so that's the second important piece of information that we have in this first verse. And the third piece of information is, when did Yeshayahu prophesy? And here we're coming to something quite outstanding, and that is that Yeshayahu prophesies during the time of four kings: Uzziyahu, Yotam, Achaz, and Chizkiyahu. Okay, so this we haven't yet calculated exactly how long these kings ruled, and to make that calculation, it's quite a challenge. But at some point we will try. We will attempt to do it. But I can tell you already that this actually spans over quite a significant time period. That the situation changed dramatically across this time period. Again, if we're trying to to place it historically, we're talking about approximately the 8th century BCE. That's when Yeshayahu began his prophecies at some point during the times of the ruling of Uzziyahu. We'll try to pinpoint exactly when. And from then, he continued to prophesy also during the son of Uzziyahu, Yotam, his son Achaz, and his son Chizkiyahu as well. So this is quite a significant time period. Okay, I'll already tell you, and this we'll discuss in future shiurim, that my father-in-law, Rav Carmel, in his books, actually also identifies certain chapters of Yeshayahu, even from the time of the king of Menashe, who was the son of Chizkiyahu. So it could be that he prophesied even during a fifth king's time period. As to why this wasn't mentioned in the title head, if this is correct, it could be because we know that Menashe was considered the most evil king in all the kings of Yehuda. So it could be that for that reason, his name was omitted, despite the fact that it is possible that there are even chapters in Yeshayahu from Menashe's time period as well. So if that's correct, then Yeshayahu's career as a prophet was even lengthier than the length that this first verse indicates already. Okay, so that's the title to Yeshayahu and some information about general information about Yeshayahu. Okay, now let's get into something very interesting, and that is the family of Yeshayahu. Okay, who was the family of Yeshayahu? And here, to try to find more information about the family of Yeshayahu is a bit of a challenge, but here we will also use the words of Chazal as well that also provided us some information. Okay, here I was asked how long is the span? It's quite lengthy. We're talking about tens and tens of years. Okay, it could be, I didn't make the calculation, but it could be approximately 50 years, possibly more. Okay, but when we get into the calculations of the years, we will hopefully get a little bit more information on that. Okay, now let's go into the family of Yeshayahu. So first of all, we have a general statement of Chazal, which is not specific regarding Yeshayahu, and that is, but regarding generally prophets that are mentioned in Tanakh. And this is something that appears in the Midrash in Vayikra Rabbah. And it says as follows, I'm on source number 4, on page 2. It says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Kol Navi shenitparesh shmo, v'nitparesh shem aviv, Navi uben Navi. V'chol Navi shenitparesh shmo, v'lo nitparesh shem aviv, hu Navi, v'aviv eino Navi. In other words, Rabbi Yochanan is telling us, any prophet whose name is mentioned in Tanakh, okay, first of all, you should know, sometimes prophets are not identified in Tanakh. Sometimes it will just say that some prophet came along without even telling us his name. But if his name is identified explicitly in Tanakh, and his father's name is also mentioned explicitly, then that means not only he was a prophet, but also his father was a prophet. However, a prophet whose name is mentioned, but his father's name is not mentioned, that means that he was a prophet, but his father was not a prophet. So therefore, what can we learn out from that? We can learn out from that Yeshayahu, since we do know the Tanakh does mention the name of Yeshayahu's father. Yeshayahu's father was Amos. So therefore, that tells us already that Amos was a prophet. Why is that significant? So first of all, you could argue that there is some general significance to this. Because let's say I'm coming along and I'm trying to speak to the public, okay? And I'm claiming that I'm a prophet. Why should they believe me that I'm a prophet? Maybe I'm just some lunatic or somebody trying to deceive them. A prophet has to, and a lot of times prophets weren't believed. So, you know, a prophet has to sort of establish himself as a prophet. How did he do that? It could be often very difficult. They were abused, they were ridiculed. It wasn't easy to be a prophet necessarily. However, let's say I'm the son of a prophet, I might have easier access. Why? Because my father has already established himself as a prophet. I'm coming along as the son of my father, continuing the tradition of prophecy. It could be that I will have easier access. Now, often prophets, they're not necessarily standing in Hyde Park and yelling out their prophecies. Sometimes or often they come to speak to kings. They need to somehow get to the entry door. How do you enter the Buckingham Palace of your times? If your father is a prophet, he's already appeared before kings, he's already known and recognized, then to make that entry could be much smoother. If you're coming not from the ranks, you're coming out of nowhere, and nobody knows your family and who you are, then just to establish yourself as a prophet and to make yourself heard could be very difficult. So that's already important information that we have, that Yeshayahu's father was a prophet. Secondly, actually, Chazal not only told us that Amos was a prophet, but they even identified for us a prophecy in Tanakh, which was stated by Amos. And here I can show you that, and this is something that we will study more in detail in future weeks, but you can see here already, this is something I mentioned that's mentioned in Rashi on the Megillah 14a, when he lists the 48 Nevi'im, the 48 prophets which are mentioned in Tanakh. So here you can see on source number 2, it says here, B'imei Amatzia, here I just underlined it here, B'imei Amatzia, Amos amar le'Amatzia, madua darashta Elohei Edom. In other words, we'll see a prophecy where there's a prophet. The Tanakh mentions a prophet that comes to King Amatzia. King Amatzia was the king, the father of Uzziah. In other words, Yeshayahu again started prophesying during the time of Uzziah. Yeshayahu's father Amos was prophesying during the times of Uzziah's father Amatzia, and he rebuked him for having done something. And there we already have some important information. In other words, now we not only know that Yeshayahu's father was a prophet, but we can even identify a prophecy of Yeshayahu's father. And that will be important information to see, and this is good background to what Yeshayahu started prophesying about, to see what his father already as a prophet was dealing with, okay? So that's already one bit of nice information that we have about Yeshayahu's background in terms of family. To add on to that, Chazal also gave us another piece of information about Amatzia, and that is as follows. Amos, rather. Amos, Yeshayahu's father. And this is something that appears in source number 5 in the Talmud in Masechet Megillah, page 10b. And there it says as follows, Amar Rab Levi, Davar ze masoret biyadenu me'avotenu, Amos ve'Amatzia achim havu. Okay, in other words, Rabbi Levi is saying, the following information is a tradition that we have from our forefathers, that Amos and Amatzia were brothers. Amos, again, is the father of Yeshayahu. Amatzia is the king of Judah, the father of Uzziah, who was afterwards the king of Yehuda. Okay, so apparently the parents of Amos and Amatzia, they didn't want to play around too much with the names of their children, so they gave very close names to both of their children, Amos and Amatzia. But this is now also an incredible bit of information, because if Amos is the brother of the king, that means that Yeshayahu is the nephew of the king and the cousin of Uzziah, the cousin of the king. In other words, Yeshayahu is not somebody taken off the street or off the neighborhood. He's a prince, okay? Can you imagine this? We have a prophet here who's actually part of the royal family. This is a completely different standing than to some other prophets who came, so to speak, from the barracks. In other words, he's not knocking on the gates of the palace. He's living in the palace. He's an actual prince. He's royalty. So the interaction between Yeshayahu and the political figures of his time is completely different. The standing that he has in front of the public is completely different. This is a royal prophet. Okay, so that already also is some very interesting information about Yeshayahu, and we will see, and Chazal in their commentary to Yeshayahu will point this out, that this actually has an effect, and that a prophet like Yeshayahu, whose royalty, speaks differently than, let's say, a prophet like Yechezkel, who's not royalty at all. And it actually has an effect on the contents of their prophecies. Okay, so that already also a very useful a piece of information on Yeshayahu. Now, another aspect of Yeshayahu's family that also is taught to us by Chazal, and we'll also try to bring some support for it from the verses as well. And this is a fascinating story, which is told in Masechet Barachot in the Talmud. A really fascinating story that, according to the tradition of the Talmud, transpired between Yeshayahu and Chizkiyahu. Again, Chizkiyahu, just to put in perspective, we mentioned 4 kings that Yeshayahu prophesied during their times: Uzziyahu, Yotam, Achaz, and Chizkiyahu. So Chizkiyahu is the 4th king. So we're talking about an episode towards the end of Yeshayahu's career as a prophet, probably towards the end of his life. Okay? So here, the Talmud here on source number 6 tells the following fascinating story. Amar Rav Hamnuna, Mai dichtiv mi ke'achacham u'mi yodea pesher davar, mi ke'akadosh baruch hu sheyodea la'asot pshara ben shnei tzadikim, ben Chizkiyahu leYeshayahu. Okay, so the background here that the Talmud is telling us that there was a certain problem in the interactions in between Yeshayahu, the prophet, and Chizkiyahu, the king. Even though they were both tzaddikim, Chizkiyahu was a righteous king, and obviously Yeshayahu as a prophet was righteous, but there was some sort of problem which God had to intervene and create some sort of compromise between them. What was the problem that they were facing? Chizkiyahu amar, Leiti Yeshayahu gabai, dehachi ashkechaan be'Eliyahu de'azah legabei achav. In other words, the issue that they were arguing about was, who is supposed to come to who? Okay, good question. This is a classical political problem. Should Yeshayahu be the one going to Chizkiyahu, or should Chizkiyahu be the one going to Yeshayahu? Should the prophet be coming to the king, or should the king be going to the prophet? So Chizkiyahu says, if Yeshayahu wants to see me and has something to tell me, he should be coming to me. And I have precedent, and there's a precedent for that, because we know that the prophet Eliyahu, he went to Achav the king. And Yeshayahu said, Yeshayahu amar leiti Chizkiyahu gabai, dehachi ashkechan bioram ben Achav, de'azah legabei Elisha. And so Yeshayahu said, no, I'm the prophet. The king, he wants to hear what I have to say. He wants to hear the word of God. He needs to come to me. And there's precedent for that as well, because we see in previous history that Yehoram, the son of Achav, he went to the prophet Elisha. So how do you solve this problem? The prophet and the king, they should be talking, but they're not talking because each one is saying, you need to come to me. Should the prime minister be going to Buckingham Palace, or should the queen be going to Downing 10? This is the problem. Ma'asa HaKadosh Baruch Hu, v'yisurim al Chizkiyahu, ואמר לו לישעיהו, לך ובקר את החולה, שנאמר בימים ההם חלה חזקיהו למות, ויבוא אליו ישעיהו בן אמוץ הנביא, ויאמר אליו, כה אמר השם צבאות, סב לביתך כי מת אתה ולא תחיה. What was the compromise that God did to solve this problem? He made Chizkiyahu sick, and then he told Yeshayahu, now you need to do Bikur Cholim, you need to go and visit the sick. Okay, so once Chizkiyahu, the king, becomes sick, Yeshayahu now cannot still claim that Chizkiyahu needs to come to him. We know if somebody's sick, if somebody's bedridden, you need to go visit him. Okay, problem solved. At least now they're speaking to each other. Yeshayahu is visiting Chizkiyahu on his sickbed. But now he comes up to Chizkiyahu and says to him, Tzav lebeitcha ki met ata velo tichya. Yeshayahu is telling Chizkiyahu, write your will. Why? Because you are about to die and you will not live. Now, there's a certain redundancy in this verse. You're telling somebody you're going to die and you're not going to live. That's a bit repetitive. So what does that mean? So he says, Maiki metata velo tichye. So the Talmud explains, metata ba'olam hazeh velo tichye l'olam haba. In other words, you're dying in this world and you will also not live to the world to come. In other words, not only are you going to be punished by dying in this world, you will also not receive your reward to the world to come, because you have sinned, apparently. Amar le mai kulei hai. So Chizkiyahu asks, well, what's this about? What did I do wrong? Chizkiyahu was a very righteous king. So he says, Amar le mishum de lo asakt bepirya v'rivya. He says, your sin is that you haven't brought children to the world. And because of that, you also receive punishment in the world to come. Amar le, so Chizkiyahu answered to him, Mishum de chazai li beruach hakodesh de nafki minai banim de lo me'alu. In other words, Chizkiyahu said to Yeshayahu, the reason I didn't want to bring children to the world is because I saw that the children, I had some ruach hakodesh, some sort of prophecy or some sort of vision, that the children that I would bear would be very wicked. And we know that that's what actually happened. The son of Chizkiyahu Menashe was the most wicked king of all of the kings of the Yehuda. So Chizkiyahu, according to the Talmud, had some sort of vision about what the action of his son would be, and he preferred not to bear children. Amar le, Yeshayahu answered to him, Behadei kavshei drachmana lamalach, mai de ifkadet ibaylach lemevad, umai de nicha kamei de kutsha brichu livid. So Yeshayahu's answer is, that's not for you to decide. God has commanded you to have children. Every man has a commandment that he must bring children to the world. Then you must fulfill that commandment. What the outcome will be, leave that in the hands of God. Okay? You can't, just because you sort of saw behind the curtain as to what will happen in the future, that doesn't allow you now to decide that you're not fulfilling the commandments of God. You need to bear children. That's a mitzvah. You have to do it. What will happen, will happen. That's out of your control. Okay. So what was Chizkiyahu's answer? Amar le hashta havli bartach. Efshar de garma zchuta didi v'didach v'nafki minai benin de me'alu. Okay, so now Chizkiyahu pulls a clever trick, and he says to Yeshayahu, okay, you want me to have children, despite the outcome. You're going to have to share some of the responsibility for this. Give me your daughter, I'll marry your daughter, and that's how we'll have children. And maybe my zchuyot, in other words, my righteous deeds, and also your righteous deeds will stand in our favor, and somehow maybe the children will come out okay. Okay? In other words, in essence, he's telling Yeshayahu, you want me to have children despite what will be? You're going to have to share some of the load for this. Give me your daughter to marry. So Yeshayahu answers him, Amar le gvar nigzera lecha gzera. So Yeshayahu said, it's too late now. The decree has already been made in the heavens that you are to die. Amar le ben amotz kale nevuatcha v'tzeh. Kach mekubelani mibeit avi aba. Afilu cherev chada munachat al tzavaro shel adam al yimna atzmo mirachamim. So Chizkiyahu is basically telling Yeshayahu, what you just said now, that's not true. That's not part of your prophecy. You cannot tell me that the decree has already been made and I have no chance. I have a tradition from my forefathers that even if a sharp knife is placed on somebody's neck, he still should pray to God, he still can be saved. Now, and there the Talmud ends, at least according to the version that we have in the Talmud before us. There are some versions which extend the story. But according to our version that we have, what happened? So we know that ultimately Chizkiyahu did live longer, and he actually did have a son. But the question is, did Yeshayahu actually end up giving Chizkiyahu his daughter to marry? Did he agree to the request at the end? So some versions of the Talmud that don't appear in the standard editions actually have a continuation to the story. Then indeed Yeshayahu gave Chizkiyahu his daughter to marry. I would like now to bring a little bit of proof from the Tanakh itself that indeed Chizkiyahu married Yeshayahu's daughter. Okay, and I'll try to share with you this proof. And this is as follows. So we know Chizkiyahu's son was Menashe. That was the next king of Judah, Menashe, the son of Chizkiyahu. Who was Menashe's mother? So it tells us, this is source number 7, in Melachim Bet, chapter 21, verse 1. It says, בין 12 שנה מנשה ומולכו, ו55 שנה מלך בירושלים, ושם אמו חפצי בה. Okay, so the mother of Menashe was חפצי בה. Now again, if we sort of continue the story of the Talmud, let's say to its anticipated ending, that would mean that חפצי בה, who was the wife of Chizkiyahu, was the daughter of Yeshayahu. Is there any proof for that? So I think there is a little bit of proof for this, that חפצי בה was indeed the daughter of Yeshayahu. And this is based on a verse in Yeshayahu chapter Samech Bet, chapter 62 in Yeshayahu, in source number 8. There's a prophecy of Yeshayahu where he prophesies about Israel, that it says, Lo ya'amer lach od azuva, u'la'artzech lo ya'amer od shemama, ki lach yikare chefzi ba, u'la'artzech be'ula, ki chafetz Adonai bach ve'artzech tiba'el. Okay, so Yeshayahu is using this term, chefzi ba. Chefzi ba again means that my desire will be for her. In other words, chefzi ba, the message is that God will desire again for Israel, despite the fact that it will appear at some point as if God has abandoned Israel at some point. It will be demonstrated again that chefzi ba, that God has desire, that he delights in Israel. And that is a prophecy of Yeshayahu. So what is that connected to a daughter of Yeshayahu? So very interestingly, if we look at other verses in Yeshayahu, we will see that Yeshayahu's children were named after prophecies of Yeshayahu. We have a prophecy, we have in chapter 7, we have a son of Yeshayahu called Shal Yashuv. And Shal Yashuv is a prophecy of Yeshayahu, which means Sha'ar, the remainder of Israel, Yashuv will return. We have a son of Yeshayahu called Immanuel. Immanuel means God is with us. We have a son of Yeshayahu called, source number 11 in chapter 8 of Yeshayahu, Maher Shalal Chashbaz. Maher Shalal Chashbaz means go out and quickly take the loot, the bounty. Okay? And this is again a prophecy of Yeshayahu. And Yeshayahu himself says in source number 12, in chapter 8, verse 18, it says, Hine anochi va'iladim asher natan li Hashem, leotot ulemoftim b'Yisrael, mi'im Hashem tzvaot Hashem ashochen behar Tzion. In other words, he says that I and my children that God has given to me are signs and omens, portents, which are omens in Israel. In other words, Yeshayahu's children were named after messages of his prophecy. In other words, Yeshayahu, when he was trying to deliver a message, it wasn't just him involved, all his family got involved. He named his children after prophecies. Now, if we see a woman called Chefzi ba, and we know that Yeshayahu has a prophecy of Chefzi ba, plus we have this whole story that Chazal tell us in the Talmud, then if we put the pieces together, we can come to the interesting conclusion that indeed this was one of Yeshayahu's children, his daughter. She indeed married Chizkiyahu like Chizkiyahu answered, and they had the son, the king of Menashe. So now we found another link of Yeshayahu to the royal family. Not only was his uncle the king, his cousin the king, but also later in life, his daughter married the king. So his king now, Chizkiyahu, was his son-in-law, and Menashe, his grandson, also became king. So clearly, Yeshayahu was royalty. He was addressing the royal family, and clearly that had a deep influence, as we'll see later on his standing as a prophet within Israel. Okay. All right, so we will stop here for this evening. Does anybody have any questions or comments, something they want to add? Okay.
I have a question, Dan, if not.
Yes, please.
It's Michael Paul. I wanted to ask you,
Oh, Michael.
so are we to understand from the fact that somebody was the child of a prophet, that the prophecy was more valuable because of the tradition, or perhaps somebody who is not the child of a prophet's prophecy would be considered more prophetic, let's say, in quotation marks, because they had to break through the infrastructure themselves? Or is that not even a question that enters into your thinking?
Well, it's a good question, but you know, it's really hard to answer. First of all, you are making an interesting point that it could be that not each prophet is the same level as another prophet, and that's something that probably I think many commentators would agree with, and they do sort of sometimes even have the audacity to try to rank prophets. So it could have had effect on that, but not necessarily. But in other words, it could be that somebody came from lower ranks, but he was still able to reach a higher level in terms of the spiritual aspect. But I think for sure we can say that it will have an effect, at least on his initial steps as a prophet. In other words, is he going to come out and speak and everybody's going to be immediately listening to him? Or is he coming out and speaking and he's getting abused and ridiculed? Okay, so I think definitely on that, it will have a big effect, whether his father is a prophet or not. And also what his social stature is. If he's a prophet coming from the royalty, then at least in terms of, you know, getting himself heard, obviously it's going to be much easier for him than somebody who's from a lower social stature in terms of trying to get himself heard. But it could have some other effects on the content of the prophecies as well, as we might see later on when we get into some of the details. So it's something to bear in mind when we're trying to understand, you know, picture before us who is the prophet, you know, what's he speaking, what's going on around him when he's speaking. This is all part of our effort to try to contextualize the prophecies.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Somebody asked me here, had Yeshayahu relation with other prophets in his time? I mean, I don't know if he had personal relations, but we can definitely see some very significant parallels with other prophets, that both he and other prophets were speaking at the same time about similar issues. So there was, I don't know if they were in contact with one another, but clearly they were getting similar messages and addressing similar issues, each in his own style and from his own perspective. Okay, I'll put my, okay, so we'll stop here.